Hey, it is Zennial Gamer, and today we're going to be talking about the massive update. And make no mistake about it, Com2Us did not oversell this. This is legitimately a massive update. Now, most of you who are watching this video are probably already familiar with the details of the update, but we are going to go through and I'm going to talk about each specific change and what impacts I think it'll have on the game, and also just my early thoughts on what we're going to need to do to build teams and farm them. Before I do that, I just want to give kind of like my high-level overview of what impacts I really think this will have on the overall game itself. So first and foremost, I know there are a lot of people out there who are saying that this update is going to widen the gap between pay-to-play and free-to-play. Personally, I actually think it's very much the opposite. I think the new B12 dungeons are going to increase drop rates to the point where free-to-play players will legitimately be able to catch up, at least on their top, let's say 10 to 20 monsters, to people who are paying on a regular basis. What's going to happen is you're going to get such higher drop rates with 6-star and legend runes that you can farm out really, really strong monsters on your top 10 to 20. Where the difference will be is that you may not have the same rune depth if you're not charging for crystals or paying for crystals. But rune depth primarily only affects things like Siege, where you really need a massive monster box. But even when we're talking about RTA, free-to-play players now, if we're only building, let's say, 10 to 15 monsters for RTA, within 6 months or, whatever that amount of time is, free-to-play players are going to be able to rune their monsters competitively against many of the top RTA players. Now, the other major impact I see this having is that it's going to dramatically accelerate the path through mid-game. So this is a good place for me to just give my own definition of the different stages of game. For me, early game is learning the game, building your first teams, beating the dungeons for the first time, beating TOA normal, and getting most of the way, if not all the way through TOA hard, depending on exactly which order of progression you're doing. Early mid-game is about building your first speed teams and building your first raid teams. Mid-game is the longest stretch of the game where you're consistently farming dungeons, you're beginning to farm raid, you're basically building rune quality and depth, and maybe you're starting a little bit to get into Guild War and Siege content. Late mid-game is where you have now built all of your, we'll call them super speed teams. You'll have built your R5 or BJR5 team. Your rune quality is starting to go up across the board. You're building Siege depth and Guild War depth, and you're starting to think about moving into RTA. Late game is where you're moving into highly competitive guilds in the higher tiers of Guardian 1 or Guardian 2 or 3. It's where you're getting into RTA. It's where you're building out lots and lots of monster depth. You're getting over 50, 70, 100 plus 6-star monsters, all of them runed pretty well. It's basically where you can do everything in the game and you're really just making tiny incremental upgrades. So with those definitions thrown out there, those are mine. I know there's lots of different definitions out there. What I see happening is mid-game is going to accelerate dramatically. Instead of there being 3 stages of mid-game, there's going to be at most 2, possibly just 1, but instead we're going to have 3 stages of late game. And this is because we're going to be able to get great rune drops so much faster that we're going to be able to build super speed farming teams much faster. We're going to be able to build raid teams much faster. Now, over the last several updates, they've already made it much, much easier to go through early game. And these two things, by the way, are extremely important because Summoner's War is 6 years old, and it is very, very hard to draw in new players in a game where they feel like they can never catch up and be competitive. So now that people can come in, start the game, they can move through early game super quick, they can move through mid game super quick, and really kind of feel like they're making constant progression and catch up to people, it helps with the game's long-term health. It's something that's really important to do. So hopefully this is going to be a very positive update for everybody. But if there is any one group of people who I think may feel a little bit pressured, it's going to be those people who have been playing for a very long time who are now going to have lots and lots of people catching up to them. The other nice thing is that even for the latest stage game players right now, the introduction of artifacts gives us all something new to kind of work on. So for my own account, for example, right now, basically all I'm farming for is 25 and 30 plus speed runes, which is, as we all know, nearly impossible to get. There's very little that I could do right now to gain additional power when it comes to things like RTA or fighting in G3 Siege, G3 Guild War. So the introduction of artifacts is going to be new content for everybody, no matter what stage of the game we're in. I personally am very excited about it. I'm very excited to see how it works out. I'm curious to see what impacts it's going to have on the overall balance. I think right now the artifacts are not going to be dramatically game-changing, But I think that over time, it sounds like Com2uS has some plans to do more with the artifacts. And so we may see the artifacts become the core of determining how strong an account is in the game. I don't think we're going to see that just yet. And that's another thing I've always really respected about Com2uS. They do things slowly, and I know this frustrates a lot of people. It frustrates me at times, to be honest, but it's why Summoner's War has survived for 6 years, and I've played so many other games that died because the developers rush out updates, they screw up the balance, they lose tons of players, and that's something I've really always loved and respected about this game, is that they do things in a slower, measured approach, and they do their best. I won't say they always do it right, but they do their best to try not to mess up the balance, and they maintain this large player base as a result. So with all of that said, let's go ahead and dive into the specific aspects of the update. So we're going to start off with the very first and the easiest part, which is the new Dimensional Hole Dungeon. It's going to be a super, super difficult dungeon that requires that we fight it manually. It's going to happen only once a month. It's going to rotate through the different dimensional holes, and the monster that we fight and the requirements of how we fight that monster are going to vary based on the dimensional holes. So for example, the first one is going to be Karzan, meaning we can only bring in Nat 4 monsters. We're going to be using dimensional hole energy to fight it. The bosses are going to have some new mechanics and some new skills. The design of it is to be extremely difficult, but something that's very cool. What Com2uS has done is designed it so that it's going to be something available to everybody. Rather than it being about monster stats, it's going to be about monster skills and abilities. So if we look at the images that are up behind me, at the top you see like 2 Lucians that you may come across. Now the first Lucian, the one on the left, is something like an early mid-game Lucian. He's got kind of a low crit rate, he's got medium crit damage, he's got pretty good attack, but not really much in the way of other speeds. The one on the right is a late-game fat Lucian. What they've done in this new dungeon is they've multiplied all monsters' base stats by 10. So if you look now at these 2 on the bottom, you'll see that Lucian, instead of having 925 base attack, he has 92,250 base attack. So the early game and the late game Lucian, they're like 4% apart in the amount of damage they do. They're less than that apart in the amount of speed. Now the one area that they are heavily apart in is in crit rate. And so what this tells us is that we may need to rune our monsters specifically for this dungeon. So for example, your Lucian doesn't need anything except 100 crit rate when he goes into this dungeon, and maybe like some extra accuracy, things like that. Whatever monsters you bring in, basically the stats that are not being multiplied are the stats that are going to need runes. You want to go in with 100 crit rate, you want to go in with lots of crit damage, you want to go in with lots of resistance. Consider this. Let's say you're bringing in a Triana. Well, when you bring in your Triana, she's going to have, I don't remember her base HP off the top of my head, but let's just easy numbers call it 10,000. That means she now has 100,000 HP. So does it make sense to put her in triple HP? Not so much, because you're not really gaining that much, where you could do a crit damage slot 4 and maybe a resistance or an accuracy slot 6. You could put some use into those runes that we don't use all that often. You build your Triana on 100 crit rate with lots of crit damage, and it's going to multiply those huge base stats. Now all of a sudden your Triana hits super hard, and all you've really done is give up like 8% HP by not using triple HP. Instead, you're going to be using crit damage and accuracy runes. So this does mean you're probably going to need to re-rune your monsters, particularly your support monsters, in order to get competitive in this stage. But it's also going to be something really new and unique, because we get to use monsters. It's going to feel like we're using endgame monsters. You're going to feel like you're using monsters with G3 runes no matter what stage of the game you're in, which should be a lot of fun. Now, the big challenge of this for earlier game players is obviously going to be the need to 6-star a lot of monsters. Now, the nice thing is Com2uS has made it super easy to 6-star your monsters. They've given more experience per fight. They've done a lot of stuff over the last several months to make it easier. But if you're an early or early mid-game player, my strong recommendation to prepare for this right now, build your water homunculus. You're going to need to 6-star a lot more monsters, which means you're going to need to farm Feynman. Build your water homunculus so that you can farm Feynman more quickly, more easily, and start to build up that stable of 6-star monsters. This is going to give us a really good reason to build more monsters even before we can rune them all. Now, with that said, be careful. Don't build so many monsters that you're using all your resources and you can't rune any of them. But you do, if you have some key monsters that you can't quite rune yet and you were thinking about runing them later, it is a good opportunity now to build those up so that you'll have them for this monthly battle. And obviously, when you're doing that, focus on the monsters that you can skill up, because skill ups are going to matter a lot, most likely, for this dungeon. Now, this dungeon is going to be once a month. It's going to use dimensional hole energy, and it's I don't have any idea yet how difficult it's going to be, how much energy it's going to take to beat. What we do know is that once you beat the entire boss dungeon, you're going to get to pick between 1 of 5 legendary ancient runes. I personally am super excited about the concept of being able to go in and come up with a new strategy monthly dungeon that's going to be based off of my monsters and not my runes. I wish this was content that came out every week or every 2 weeks. We have to see how time consuming it is. Maybe every 2 weeks would have been the right way to go. I do wish it was going to be something that I could do a little bit more often, but I would like to see, honestly, a slightly smaller reward and a slightly greater frequency. Now, I love the fact that it's not RNG based. Absolutely love the fact that the reward is not RNG based. I love that we get to make a selection. I just don't want to see too many of us condense into the exact same power down the road. But even with that said, I think the direction that Com2uS is going with this, the fact that they're letting us pick what we get from the event, that is absolutely phenomenal. I hope that they do this type of thing with more events in the future. And we haven't talked about artifacts yet, but obviously there are going to be some other big changes, so maybe this won't actually create that level of condensation that I'm concerned about. Maybe it won't be that big of a deal. And we also, as different artifact skills come out, we don't know that will runes are going to be quite as essential. You know, if it's like a TOA hard, then maybe once a month is the right amount of time. Because TOA hard is obviously a full day event, and this could be a full day or more of work. So maybe once a month is the right amount of time, but just the general premise of being forced to play the game, of not just grinding out autos, that's really exciting to me. At the same time, I am super excited about the strategy. I'm super excited about playing with monsters that have 10 times boosted stats, seeing those big numbers. Now, the last part of the monthly dungeon is that people are also going to be able to get Grindstones. This one looks like it's going to be a randomized reward. And it's a very nice part of the reward. I don't know exactly how many pulls we'll get from the box, what the drop rates from Legends are. Definitely going to be nice to be able to have another way to get some gems and grinds, though. What I do hope, what would be really nice, is if we get to open this second box before we open the first box, so that we're able to know in advance, like, hey, I just pulled a Legend Rage gem, so maybe that's the rune that I want to pull to synergize with it this month. Okay, so now let's move on to the update of the Kairos Dungeon. First and foremost, you guys, did you see the graphics? I mean, like, I'm a super competitive player. I don't play the game for graphics. I play the game for competition. But oh my god, those graphics are amazing. I am like so blown away by the designs of the new dungeons. I'm really excited to see them. I know once we've farmed it a million times, the graphics will, be less engaging. But man, for the first day, I can just see myself staring at the farming of these dungeons all day long because the graphics look so cool. I think overall these might be the nicest designs I've seen them introduce into the game. Now, beyond the designs, the biggest thing of the 2 new Kairos dungeons is going to be artifacts. It's really hard to anticipate exactly what the final shape of these farming teams are going to look like. I do suspect that these dungeons are going to be much more difficult. I don't think that they're necessarily going to be late game only dungeons, and I think that's also part of why we're going to see the new B12s and why it's going to be easier for people to progress from mid to late game. But I will say this, it looks like these boss fights feel like they're going to be designed a little bit more towards the dimensional hole style than the other older Kairos style, and I think that they're probably going to be slightly longer fights. I think they're going to be a little bit harder to build towards. But overall, I do think that we'll be able to see lots of nice teams pop up, and kind of like Rift, I don't think it's going to be absolutely essential that we're immediately getting out to the top dungeon levels. I think it would be totally fine to farm out for like hero artifacts and use those, or even rare artifacts and use those to make your monster stronger and move into hero dungeons and then move into farming for Legend Dungeon. But what I really want to talk about most is the actual artifacts and the impact that it's going to have on the game. Artifacts are going to be, for lack of let's just think of it as like yet another rune. So basically, you're going to have your normal 6 runes with your rune set bonuses and all that, and then you're going to get artifacts. And these are going to have kind of the same impact as a rune in that they're going to give you they're going to give you special bonuses on your monster, but unlike a rune, these are not going to be percentage-based substats. Instead, they're going to be special modifiers. Now, you can have two different artifacts. One is for the attribute of your monster, and the other is for the type of your monster. So if it's an HP monster, you get an HP type artifact. Attack monster, you get an attack type artifact. This is going to create some interesting balancing necessities, I think, as we go forward, because there's a lot of monsters many of us can probably agree are not classified as well as they should. Monsters that come to mind, for example, might be like Lauren or a Vertihile, who we typically build as support monsters, even though they're attack types. But there are dozens of them. I do really hope that Com2uS goes through in the next major balancing patch and starts to adjust monster types. This was something that was probably never a huge deal in the past, but it will become significantly more important going forward. On the other hand, Com2uS may be doing this partly on purpose in order to guide us towards using the monsters as they were intended. So when we look at, for example, attack type artifacts, these are going to give us multipliers on damage. So maybe the idea here is that it creates a balance in that if you're going to use your Lauren as a support type monster, she's not going to benefit from artifacts as much as she would if you were using her the way she was intended. So it'll be interesting probably to see which way we go. Now, I still think there are some monsters that definitely need a change in type just because their kits are so designed to be that type. But those are probably things that can be handled over the long term through balancing patches. In the short term, I think most monsters are close enough to where they need to be. Now, for the actual artifacts themselves, we're going to see that they give us some base stats. For starters, we can get about 1500 HP, or we can get attack or defense added to our monsters. It's nothing really game-changing here, but it definitely is nice that it's going to give us a little bit more defensive stats for the most part, or offensive stats, because you figure if the artifacts are going to make the offensive monsters stronger, then we need to be able to take a little bit more damage. That leads me to my one and only really major concern of artifacts. I am concerned that all these damage boosting artifacts may bring back the cleave meta a little bit. My hope is that the artifacts on the whole will balance us out to where things don't really change that much, to where cleave is one viable option but not the viable option. So when I say bring back the cleave meta, obviously cleave meta is still out there. And it's probably not as prevalent as it was a while ago. Com2uS has done a great job of introducing, now we have control, we have sustain, we have tanky bruiser, we have cleave, we have a lot of different ways to team build, where when I started the game, it was pretty much cleave or bust. And what I hope is that we stay with this more balanced approach where there's a lot of different ways to team build and it doesn't go back to just cleave or bust. So we will see what the overall impact is, and I think this is such a major change that it may be difficult to get the balancing exactly right on the first try, but I do trust that they're going to continue to introduce some balancing patches going forward, and I am optimistic overall that we're going to maintain this somewhat more balanced type of team building and that this is not going to drive us in that direction. So part of that is, for example, being able to add HP and defense to your monsters through the artifacts. Now, artifacts like runes, they're going to drop in Magic, Rare, Hero, or Legend, or Normal, and then they're going to have sub-properties 1, 2, 3, 4 based on the rank of the artifact, and then you're going to be able to power them up to 15, and you're going to boost those sub-properties, either, boosting the sub-property that's already on the artifact that dropped, or getting a new sub-property based on the rank of the artifact. Think of it, it's just exactly like runes. So a hero artifact will have 3 sub-properties. Those 3 sub-properties will boost randomly to +9, and then a 4th sub-property will be added at +12. Now, we can see down here that the sub-property chart is very, very large. There's a wide range of sub-properties, and they did say on stream that they're thinking of adding more sub-properties over time. So just looking at a couple of these at random, we see that there's a bunch of stuff that's going to increase damage. We see that there's some stuff that will increase recovery, accuracy, crit damage, crit rate, damage dealt by counterattacks. So there's going to be some very specific sub-properties that are intended to synergize with a monster type. So let's look at, for example, bomb damage plus N. So putting an artifact with bomb damage on like Triana makes no sense. Obviously, that's going to be an artifact that's meant for Ciara. or for a Dover or Malacca, something like that. So they're really trying to make it so that we have to put a little bit more thought process and a little bit more thought into the design of our monsters. Now, the last thing we need to know about artifacts is that there are going to be these conversion stones that will allow us to convert one effect on an artifact. This is the one aspect that I think is genuinely going to benefit pay-to-play players more than free-to-play, is that you can basically sell monsters, default monsters, in order to get these conversion stones. Now, first off, I want to throw this out there, guys. Don't forget about fusion. So if you are free to play, you can fuse default 4-star monsters every week to get your conversion stones. Yes, I know that's a lot of work, but it's going to be part of the overall farming process. You change a default 4-star monster for a conversion stone, you have the chance to get a legend conversion stone, and that is really going to help you strengthen your monsters overall. So fusions are going to be really, really important. It's something that's going to come back into what we're doing on a regular basis. Now, the one area, as I said, that's going to affect pay-to-play players is that ability to change a default 5-star monster once a month for a legend conversion stone. Now, we can change out 12 4-star monsters a month with a chance at legend conversion stone, so I don't think it's going to be too disproportionately in favor of pay-to-play, especially because even for most players, giving up a default 5-star once a month, that's a lot. Unless we're fusing out the 5 stars. And so that might be another thing, is for free to play, it's a lot more energy intensive to fuse out a 5-star, but you could do it, and then you could trade that in for your legend once a month, or if you did it once every few months, for example. So overall, I think this is going to really advantage the pay to play because they're going to be summoning more, they're going to have some more nat 5s, but I don't think it's going to be like game breaking because there are still ways for everybody to get legends. A legend can still roll terribly also. Imagine giving up a nat 5 to get a conversion stone and then you get one that doesn't even have a property you want and then it min rolls. That's pretty painful no matter how much you're paying in the game. Now, overall, I think the artifacts, when I look at the artifacts, I don't think, because we're only equipping 2 per monster, and some of these artifact effects have relatively low percentages, and then everything has to roll just perfect. You know, if we look at the actual rolls, you see, for example, damage dealt by counterattack can increase by as low as 1%. So, you know, you quad roll that, and it's like 5% boosted damage by counterattack. It's really not a big deal. So obviously we're going to be farming out a lot of artifacts, and just like runes, we're going to be looking for good rolls. I see this as being a really, really long-term process. This is going to be probably the primary focus in the game for many of us for the next 6 months, a year, or longer. And that's part of why they've done the B12s, is so that rune farming is no longer the primary focus, except in early and mid games. I don't ultimately see artifacts changing the power as much as, for example, runes do right now, because we only equip 2 of them, but I do see it being a tipping point in power. I think it's going to be key, and then I think obviously the people who get their good artifacts first and who get up on the artifacts first, they're going to benefit a little bit more. Mostly, I see artifacts being just something that's super, super fun because they have all these unique effects, and it's going to allow us to put a lot more thought process and strategy into the design of our monster builds. That, to me, is the most exciting part because it's really the part of the game that I always love the most. If you guys have, well, Siege is what I love the most, honestly, but if you guys watch my videos, you see that I spend a lot of time with runes and the optimizer, planning out the builds of my monsters. That, for me, is something that's really fun, so this adds another layer of strategy to that, which I'm very excited about. Now, Com2uS did indicate that they have some plans to do more with the artifacts as well, to add more sub-properties, to do more things with it. And I think this opens up an entire new genre, meta, whatever you want to call it. I think that this is going to be, there's a lot of possibilities to allow our monsters to grow and expand and to do lots of really cool stuff and introduce new ways to balance the game through this system. So I really love that. This opens up a whole new set of possibilities. So overall, I think this is a freaking amazing change. Very, very, very excited to start playing around with the artifacts. I think for me, I'm like super excited about both the dimensional hole boss and the artifacts. I think the once a month strategy thing is going to be super fun, but I think this is like a daily sort of fun for me. So both of those changes, very excited about. Now let's talk about the last change, which is going to be the changes to the Kairos Dungeons. Now the last change is actually the easiest and shortest to talk about. The first change they made is very minor. They changed all of the dungeons to be mono element, which I think is actually a very intelligent change. So giants are now all water instead of changing attributes. Dragons are now all fire. Going back to that whole point about mid-gamers, early gamers, and progression, this allows you to start building your teams earlier on as you're building through the dungeon, so I think that's very smart. The B11 and B12s, we see that they're going to have higher drop rates, and in particular, B12s are only going to drop 6-star runes. They've also increased the drop of legend runes by 2.5 times in B12, and then the overall drop rate of 6-star legend runes by 1.5 times in dimensional hole farming. What this is going to mean is basically everything I talked about earlier with early and mid-game players being able to progress to late game faster. When they first announced this on stream, I'll admit I was a little bit nervous because without being able to see like the overall changes in one's place through the patch notes, I was concerned that we would see too much compression in endgame and everybody would start to be the same and equal. But as we see the changes with the artifacts, I see why they did this. It makes a lot of sense. We have so much more to farm now with artifacts, spending an extra day a month in Dimensional Hole, things like that. They needed to make rune farming a little bit easier, and at the same time, they need to make the game more inviting for new players. Overall, I think this is going to be a really good change. I also think that this is, as I said before, but I'm going to say it again, I think this is really going to start to compress the gap between free-to-play and pay-to-play. I know people feel the opposite, and they're worried about it. But what I see is that right now I can do a GB10 run in 20 seconds. A free-to-play player, maybe 50. It's 2.5 times as fast. These dungeons are probably going to be a little bit tougher. I won't be able to fat Julie them. Maybe it'll take me 40 seconds to run a B12, and it takes a free-to-play player 80. So they're actually going to be able to run the dungeons proportionately faster than me, and at the same time they're going to be getting significantly more drop rates. So where I might do 800 runs a day, and right now that results in me getting 2 good runes a day, now the free-to-play players are going to be getting so many good runes that we don't have to do 800 runs a day, and instead my focus is going to be in artifacts, where I think the power separation is not going to be quite as dramatic, at least not yet, as it is from having amazing runes, because the artifacts seem to have, because you're only equipping 2 artifacts as opposed to equipping 6 runes. So even if I have 2 OP artifacts, it's not as big of a difference as if I had 6 OP runes. So we are going to see a closing of the power gap, at least in the short term. Now, obviously, the new dungeons are going to probably involve the development of some new teams. I will say that we were told in our Discord server today by the German community manager who actually ran the German stream, that he was told that the B12s are going to be about the same difficulty as the B10s are now, that all the dungeons are going to be made easier. We can't really confirm if that's the case until they come out. I personally actually hope the B12 is going to be just a little bit harder, just hard enough that we can't fat Juliet, because that is what will close that gap between free-to-play and pay-to-play. But even if they're the same, still going to really close the gap, because the drop rates are going to be so much better that farming in volume is no longer going to be as big of an advantage. Overall, I think this is a really positive change to help offset the need to spend so much time farming, and also to give us more time to farm in the new areas of the game. So with that said, guys, that is it for today's video. Those are my takes on the updates. I am really, really excited to see all of this implemented. I do believe that these are going to be some really amazing changes. I think it's going to refresh and make the game fun and new for a lot of us at all stages of the game. I think it's going to be really inviting and much easier for new players to get into the game, for mid-game players to catch up to late-game players. The only group of players I worry about a little bit are current late-game free-to-play players, who, as I said, may see some of those mid-gamers catching up to them more quickly and may not take that as well. But on the whole, I think a lot of these changes were things that were essential for the long-term growth and development of the game. As always with these big updates, I get really excited when I see them, not just because I'm excited to play the new content, but because I'm excited to see that we're playing a game where the developers genuinely take a long-term view. They want to see Summoners War around for a very long time. And trust me when I tell you that is not the case with a lot of mobile games. A lot of mobile game developers are simply looking to make the fastest buck they can, let the game die out, and then go move on to their next game. Come To Us does not do that with Summoners War. They genuinely want this game to go on and on for years, and for me that's something that's really important and exciting. Hope it is for you guys as well. And with that said, those are my thoughts on this update, so hope you enjoyed it. Please, in the comments, tell me what you think, if you agree, if you disagree. I'll look forward to reading them. I appreciate you watching, and I'll see you next time. Hey guys, if you're still with me to this point, then that means that you probably liked the video, found it entertaining, or even better, both. So please smash the like button, hit the subscribe button, and leave a comment down below, because those things help the channel grow, and more importantly, they show me that the video is useful, and that's the whole reason I do this in the first place.